We are really gearing up here for an incredible fall. I'm glad you're able to join us for today. Hope you got some Swedish pastry and saw the Swedish dancers, and I think they're going to bring the Swedish fiddlers back into the Great Hall after talks. At any rate, I'm Patricia Mcdonald, director of the Wichita Art Museum, and happy to see such a good group for two really wonderful historical talks. Also hoped, it's the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum who have organized and have out in the Great Hall the book fair. So my instruction to all of you is you need to purchase a used book to take home today. Proceeds help the Friends who help the Wichita Art Museum. So that's my little advertisement. At any rate, we're really proud to bring this exhibition on B.J.O. Nordfeld to Wichita. It's the first scholarly project on this artist in a good number of decades. There are 65 absolutely glorious works of art, paintings in the exhibition. And it's really, as you see by going into the galleries, he's really an extraordinary, exceptional artist. So it's a major loan show, and we're the first stop on the national tour. Such museums as the Metropolitan in New York, the Smithsonian's Hirshhorn Museum, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, the New Mexico Museum of Art, and University of Minnesota's Weissman Art Museum have all lent to the show, and USD 259, the public school system here in Wichita, also had a wonderful Nordfeld painting that's been included in the show. So we're the first stop, and then it goes on to Minneapolis. This is an artist who was really quite esteemed in his lifetime. After he passed away, none other than the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York gave him a memorial exhibition, and during his lifetime, one-person exhibitions were staged by the Whitney Museum in New York, the Corcoran Gallery in DC, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Want to acknowledge we have a VIP in the audience connected to Nordfeld. We have the great-nephew of Nordfeld, Don Pearson, traveled all the way from the West Coast to be with us to open this show. So really wonderful. And he, if you've been through the show, you've seen that wonderful portrait of Clara, the tall, standing, absolutely magnificent woman. That's his grandmother. 30 seconds? Sure, come up, 30 seconds. Why not, right?
I've been using the word thrilled, and I am so thrilled at the number and the turnout that the Wichita Art Museum has been able to do for this wonderful beginning tour of my great uncle. So thank you, and thank you to all of those who are out in the building. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Gosh, and that many more people across the coming months, Don. This is an exhibition that we stage here in Wichita through the winter holidays and into January. So fortunate that we're opening this show here, fortunate that we have such enlightened and generous patrons of our museum to help us make this exhibition possible in Wichita. So bear with me. It's important to acknowledge and thank people who contribute so that we can mount an exhibition like this. And the list is not short. So this is an exhibition that was organized by the Weissman Art Museum at the University of Minnesota. Here in Wichita, our presenting sponsor is the Latner Family Foundation. The Trust Company of Kansas and the DeVore Foundation are lead sponsors. Charles Baker and the Judy Slauson Family Exhibition Fund provided major underwriting. The Shaw Family Foundation and Sarah T. Smith are principal sponsors. Generous support also came in the door from Ann and Martin Bauer, the Berry Foundation, Donna Bunk, Eric Engstrom and Robert Bell, Rich and Joey Giblin, Carol and Guy Glidden, John and Karen Hageman, and Mary Sue Smith. Additionally, sponsors included the Charles Baker and Jim Phillips Exhibition Fund Emily Bonavia, Harold and Evelyn Gregg, Norma Griever, Helen and Ed Healy, Terry and Lou Heldman, Anita Jones and Richard Height, Delmar and Mary Clucky, Errol and Susan Luganbill, Tom and Mindy Page, Debbie and Ron Sinclair, Georgia and Keith Stevens, and Janice and Jeff Finsickle. Quite a list, many of whom are actually in the room. Great applause to all these people who've helped make this happen. The wonderful Downings, Paula and Barry Downing, are guardian angels of so many important things in Wichita and culturally, and their supports helps provide for all the public programs at the Art Museum through the entire year. And then the Friends of the Wichita Art Museum and the City of Wichita are supporters of all our exhibitions across all year. So really important that we are able to attract that degree of support so that we can bring this kind of world-class art to Wichita. So the exhibition itself for us at WAM wasn't quite enough. One of the very important reasons to bring this exhibition to Wichita were the connections that this artist had here. He moved to Santa Fe in 1918, 1919. There were so many Wichitans who, to escape the summer heat, went to Santa Fe. A nice number of those people were also artists who networked, and we're gonna hear shortly from Barbara Thompson about exactly how all that came together and worked. But they're really wonderful connections for this artist in Wichita. So we organized a small exhibition that's in our DeVore Gallery. Hopefully you've already seen that. If you weren't aware of it, it's not in the exhibition proper. Please make sure you catch that too. And there was to be an essay in the catalog that accompanies this exhibition on Nordfeld in Wichita, and it just didn't come together. And Barbara Thompson, our first speaker this afternoon, discovered that, and I'm gonna put it rather politely, she was disappointed. And it motivated her to pull together her own research, and Barbara has now authored, and available in the store, there's a modest catalog helping the documentation and really clarifying the history of Nordfeld and Wichita. So it is from that research and from that passion that Barbara is with us today to give the first talk, Nordfeld and Wichita. I love her title. You can see here, Plains, Pizza, Prince, and Patrons. She'll help us to understand how that applies to Nordfeld here in Wichita. And the second talk then at 2 o'clock by Professor Jay Price, who's chair of the history department at WCO. I'm gonna go ahead and introduce them both now. Between the two talks, we'll take just a short 3-5-minute break and be back in the room. Hopefully, Barbara Thompson, hopefully she's someone nicely known by most of you in the room because she's become such a regular at the Wichita Art Museum. She's a curator and a collector, an author and a researcher, and here at WAM we consider her just plain extraordinary. She is the granddaughter of the artist C.A. Seward, who was the driving force behind the creation and founding of the Prairie Print Makers. So we've worked with Barbara for a nice number of years now on a whole succession of exhibitions devoted to Prairie Print Makers and Prairie Print Maker artists. Do not miss the Lloyd Foltz exhibition that is on the first floor of our building is just one example. Barbara is a native of Wichita. Her undergraduate degree came from K-State. She has a graduate degree from the University of Michigan in art history, and she worked in a number of leading design firms in Wichita, but she transitioned to more than a decade in art museums, in the art museum profession, where she headed education departments at the Cranbrook Art Museum in Michigan, and then the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, and ultimately the Denver Art Museum, obviously in Colorado. She's been a devoted scholar and collector of early American prints, sort of turn of the century, early 20th century. She's co-author of the 1980 book Prairie Print Makers, and as I said, she's partnered with us with just a nice number of exhibitions and wonderful historical catalogs connected to those exhibitions over recent years. Dr. J. Price, absolutely beloved in Wichita, I would say, both for his very sharp intellect, but also his kindness and manner. We've greatly appreciated his willingness to collaborate with us at the Wichita Art Museum in just a whole host of ways, including the talk today. Dr. Price has been at Wichita State for 22 years now. He's been the chair of the history department since 2012. His publications and book reviews, so writings that he's done, spread across 7 pages of his resume, of his vita, and I didn't want to even count the number of pages for presentations and lectures. It's a pretty thick collection of his activity, and then the number of students and their either dissertations or a master's thesis that he's mentors is quite extraordinary. At any rate, he is a sterling public historian, actively examining how our past shapes and contributes to ways that we behave and think today. Just for Wichita, he has book projects on Lebanese heritage, African American and Latino communities, and Cowtown and its image of Wichita, El Dorado as an oil boom town. He wrote Wichita's Legacy of Flight, and he also wrote a book on Kansas Mennonite church architecture. He started his career with a book on the story of Arizona state parks. He's originally from Arizona, and we're going to learn so much from him today about Swedish travel to the Midwest and to Kansas, and how they settled here and continue with such incredible influence in our city, in our state, in our region today. So those are the 2 glorious talks we're about to enjoy. So I invite Barbara Thompson up to the stage. Thank you.
I wanted to do this a little casually, so if I talk too fast or right in the middle of something, you just have a burning question, raise your hand. We'll stop and deal with whatever you want more information on. There's a lot to cover just to talk about Nordfeld, and I titled my talk, Planes and Pizza. I grew up in Wichita, but now I live in Denver now, and people are always saying, "You're from Wichita?" And I say, "Yeah, you know Wichita. You know airplanes, and you probably know pizza." And that's how they relate. And then they say, oh, okay. And we all know that. But the other thing that we seem to always be missing is the fact that this was, at one point, the center of printmaking. There was an exhibition that started in Wichita in 1928, lasted clear through 1990. And if you wanted to be somebody in the print world, you had to be juried into that exhibition. That's how important it was. And here it is in Wichita, Kansas. But Wichita's history really starts with, in the history of art, with the amazing number of patrons. But the history of the city starts with entrepreneurs. A.A. Hyde, 1867, opens a trading post, and that's the beginning of Wichita. By the time Nordfeld is on the scene in the 1920s, the population has grown from that small little trading post to 72,000. In the years that Nordfeld's in and out of the city, which is almost 20 years, the population comes close to doubling. That's the big change that occurred in this city. Let me see if I can, there we go. So Nordfeld's in Wichita from 1921 to 1937, but he retains friendships and connections to Wichita clear up until the time of his death. And he was known, Nordfeld was actually his mother's maiden name. He took that name rather than his real last name, Olson, because there was a famous painter named Olson, and he didn't want a computer ever get confused with the man. And so, but he was mainly called Nord or Nordy. He has a long, complicated history. He immigrates with his family from Sweden, and they settle in Chicago, and he's 13 years old. And he does the obvious thing for somebody who's interested in art, eventually enrolls at the Art Institute in Chicago. Then he gets a chance of a lifetime for a young artist, and he is hired to go to Paris, to the big World's Fair in Paris. And that's where his career really takes off. Then he goes from Paris to London, back to Sweden to visit his grandmother, then goes back to Chicago, moves on to New York, goes back to Europe, then he's back in Chicago, goes to the Pacific Coast, is back in Europe. He moves around a lot, and he's always searching for opportunities to learn and exhibit his work and support himself. So in 1914, like all American artists, he's forced to return to the United States, and he settles in New York, but also begins to spend time in Provincetown. And then he moves to San Francisco, and he's drafted, and he works in the camouflage division. And while he's there, one of his friends is in the same division, William Penhallow Henderson, who was a friend from Chicago, who had by that time settled in Santa Fe. So he convinces Nordfeld to visit him in Santa Fe, and that's how Nordfeld gets to Santa Fe. And he settles there, and believe it or not, actually stays someplace for almost 10 years. His first exhibition is in Wichita, and we're going to talk about that. And it's with the Provincetown printers at C.A. Seward's studio. And Wichita is not only then connected to Santa Fe and Taos, but also to the Provincetown through a Wichita native. And then from 1922 to 39, he visits and works in Wichita. And only briefly does he teach in Minneapolis. And it's sort of an interesting story that his second wife was from Minneapolis. And so that's how Minneapolis came to inherit so much of Nordfeld's work. Finally, in 1937, he settles permanently in New Jersey. And now we're going to really start talking about him. Let's see if I can learn how to work this thing. There we go. We're going to talk about him through prints because that's mainly how he earned his living. He was a painter, as you can see by that exhibition, and a fabulous painter. But he supported himself with his commissions for portraits, but primarily through prints. So it's prints that are making him move around and take all those trips and do so much traveling. And it's because of prints that he comes to Wichita. Oh, come on. There we go. So like I said, his first experience going back to Europe is for the World's Fair in Paris. And it's in 1900, and we all know it because that's when the Eiffel Tower was built as part of that World's Fair. And he's there, and Paris is an amazing place at that time. Japanese prints had just started to be exhibited in Paris at a previous exposition. And by that time, all the Impressionist painters like Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Mary Cassatt had gotten very interested in Japanese prints and the way they presented the material, the use of color, compositions. And Nordfeld is quite taken with it. There are galleries all over Paris selling Japanese prints. So he's very taken with this. And I'm going to get good at this. And on the left, 2 Japanese prints. On the right, 2 Nordfeld prints. You can see how influenced he was by Hiroshige's two most famous prints, The Wave and Fireworks. And with this, at this point, what we know as the international block print renaissance begins to occur, and he's a very big player in it and important to it. Let's look at some more of his prints, if I can. There we go. So he he wants to get good at it. And you'll find, as I talk, he always goes to the source, the best source he can find to take a lesson from. So he goes from Paris to London to study with Frank Morley Fletcher, who at that point was the leading and one of the very earliest non-Japanese to make color block prints. The two on the top are Frank Morley Fletcher's work, and on the bottom are Nordfeld's. The one on the left was actually exhibited in Wichita in that print show I was talking about. If you wanted to be considered a serious printmaker, you had to be in the show in Wichita, and it was featured in the Wichita Beacon. And in the two on the bottom, you can see how quickly Nordfeld became very skilled at making color block prints. So he lives in Chicago and he makes a series of them, but he's not, oh, criminy. You're gonna see the holes. There we go, now let's go back. But he didn't stay long with one kind of thing. He wants to master everything. So about that time, the etching revival, which had started in Paris, really takes off in Chicago, and a group known as the Chicago Society of Etchers is formed. And Nordfeld becomes very much a part of that group. But he wants to go to the original source and learn from the best, so he goes back to Paris. And the revival really starts in Paris and is also in London. And there are two examples on the bottom, and probably the most well-known to everybody is Whistler, and he's one of the leading spirits of that. And so Nordfeld goes to study and to meet these people. Here's a few more of his etchings. And he gets a job for magazines, illustrating stories for magazines. So he travels to Tangier, he's in Florence, he gets commissions to do a series on constructions and skyscrapers in Chicago, and then also one in New York. But again, he's making his living from making prints. And you can see, every medium he takes on, he becomes extremely competent. So as I said, at one point he is back in New York during the war, and he winters in Provincetown. And Provincetown is important to all of us because the head of the Provincetown Art School was John Noble, and the Nobles are a Wichita family. And so that's immediately a connection of Wichita to Provincetown. But while he's in Provincetown, Nordfeld invents a new way to make a color print. Normally for a color print, for every color you carve a little block. It's the top surface of the block that prints is the print. And so he has to carve a block for every single color. You don't want to do that. It takes a lot of time. And then you have to register them so that they all line up as you print. So what he does is create a method, what's called the white line print. And he divides these colors up with a white line. You can see around her sash, there's a white line, so it separates the green. So all he has to do is carve one block with all these incised white lines, paint the green on, paint the bluish purple of her skirt, the turquoise color of the young girl's little shirt, and he can print them all at once. And lots of artists take that up. And an important one is Blanche Lazelle. Boats in the Water. That's a print that was originally in Seward's collection because she sent her prints to Wichita to be in that exhibition for something like 20 years. And her prints now sell for $50, $60, $75 or more $1,000. She's that important, but she had to be in the show in Wichita. And right next to her is another artist, Juanita Smith. And it's a much more complicated use of white line prints. But again, it's how that method that Nordfeld invented took hold. So like I told you, during the war, he was stationed, he was in San Francisco, got drafted, and he was in the camouflage division. And he continued to make prints. I actually bought the top two and gave them to the museum, and I bought them at an auction, and there was one other bidder. And all the time I'm bidding against him, I thought, you don't know, buddy, I'm winning these. Whatever it takes, we need these prints in the museum's collection. But when the two lower ones are from his time at years in Santa Fe, and they're Santa Fe subject matter. Now, this is kind of the crux of the thing. From its very beginning, Wichita was an entrepreneurial town. And the city fathers figured that out. They planned it. They promoted it. So the railway road connections at that time came through Wichita. So it was easy to get to, and they planned it that way and promoted it. So we have early kind of patrons who are paving the way for what happened in Wichita. And so at the beginning point, the first exhibitions, the Wichita Art Association is formed in 1920, really goes into action in 21. And they have their exhibitions at the Carnegie Library, the Wichita Public Library. And then they hold their classes in the Butts building. And at one point, Nordfeld even has a studio in the Butts building, but that's where lots of the art activities took place. Seward has a studio, and that's one of the early galleries. The earliest gallery was in the Martin's Art Shop, the local paint store, which is pretty typical across the country. And then Seward opened his gallery in about 1920, way to it, and started doing print shows. And prints were so important for this part of the country because if you think about shipping art, paintings are expensive, they're hard to pack and ship, prints aren't. So it was a way for Wichita to stay in touch with both coasts and to send their prints out and receive them. So that's why they were the ideal forum for it. But it's an interesting point in Wichita's history because almost simultaneously, the Wichita builds its public library, which is very classic, what's called Beaux-Arts or European-styled architecture, and which is the discussion of that's supposed to represent the highest values and cultural achievement. But also, at the same time, the Allens, Henry and Elsie Allen, are building their home and have hired Frank Lloyd Wright, who represents the total opposite in theories of architecture, that the architecture should blend with its environment. So in the same thing, that's how, what do I want to say, with it, Wichita was in understanding what was going on and the cultural discussions. So I talked a little bit about John Noble, and in 1921, the Wichita Art Association works with John Noble, and they have a big exhibition of the Provincetown painters. And simultaneous to that, C.A. Seward, in his studio, in his gallery, puts together, actually, no, he doesn't do it in his gallery, he does it for the Wichita Art Association, and they do American block prints. And so you see all of these Provincetown printers are shown in Wichita in, what do I have? February of 1922. Just a few months before that, they had their first showing in New York City. That gives you some idea of how important Wichita was in the print world. They're shown them first in New York, and then they come to Wichita. Now, at that point, that's the first time Nordfeld's prints are shown in Wichita. He'd previously been shown in 1917 in the annual Messiah exhibition in Lindsborg, but he was just he didn't know Lindsborg. He was just kind of in a group of Swedish painters that were shown in Lindsborg. So his first big showing in Wichita is going to be in the Provincetown exhibition. And that's how he gets to know Wichita. And it feeds right into his current interest in printmaking, which I'm really going to talk about a lot, but I want to introduce you to the two characters who are really working hard to make Wichita an art colony. and an important center for the arts. And they're two buddies. If you read the newspaper, the society columns are just the news reporting on the arts. They talk about Davidson, Ed Davidson, and C.A. Seward, two dramatically different men who were just close friends because they had a common mission to make Wichita a center for arts. Ed Davidson is the son of a banker, and he is mainly interested in the arts, convinces his dad to send him to the Chicago Institute of Art. And so he studies painting and drawing there for 3 years, and then says in a later interview, I knew I wasn't going to be good enough to support myself by painting, plus I wanted to go back to Wichita. And so I just went back to Wichita, and he worked in the bank and eventually inherited the bank. Contrast to that is Seward. Seward's born in Chase, Kansas. His father is not a wealthy banker at all. His father was a drayman, so he earned his living with his horses and hauling things. And right about this time, that becomes a defunct way to earn a living because he's replaced by automobiles. So it's a total contrast in family situations. And Seward finally saved enough money to attend school for 1 year and study in Topeka with George Melville Stone and Albert Reed, the cartoonist. And then he has to go out on his own. So first thing he does, he opens a little design studio in Lindsborg, and then eventually gets an offer to move to, and that's where he befriends Sansane. At one point, Sansane doesn't want to teach his summer art classes, so Seward trades him painting lessons for teaching those classes for him. He's just a naturally gifted draftsman and artist, and he takes full advantage of that. And by 1907, he's received an offer to move to Wichita and become the commercial artist and do the promotion for a tractor company, and that's how he gets to Wichita. So we've got two men from completely different backgrounds who become close friends because they share this common desire to turn Wichita into an important center for the arts, and they do it. But I love this combination. You can see how close they were. You can see that they were probably sitting side by side making this painting of the Arkansas River and just totally interpreting it two different ways. And how am I doing? I'm going to quickly tell you a great story about these. The one on the left, my younger brother inherited, and the one on the right is one that Ed Davidson gave to the museum. So I called my brother and I said, we want you to loan your painting for this exhibition. But you know, for years I've been telling you need to have some restoration done on it. And he says, oh, okay. And so he takes it to a good friend of his, is an art restorer. And this guy goes off on an adventure, and there's like a 10-page report on this. What he discovers on this painting is an unusual form of dust. All of us who lived in Kansas and know this painting went through the 1930s knows exactly what that dust is. So he has to invent a way to remove dust bowl dust from the surface of this painting. And you can see the difference in this Seward painting that's real bright and lively and the one from Ed Davidson that hasn't been restored and had the dust bowl dust removed from it. There's sort of an interesting thing. But you can see that's just one of, I don't know how many little news stories are about Davidson and Seward doing stuff and really working hard to turn Wichita into something. And I was searching for photographs of both of the two of them. Of course, I have ones of my grandfather, Seward, but Ed Davidson is very elusive. He must not have liked the way he photographed. We don't know. So at one point in time, the sculptor, one of the young art students that was part of the community, did a bust of each of those, and both of those were by Bruce Moore. We have Seward on the left and Ed Davidson on the right. Well, there we go. So, like I said, Nordfeld comes to Wichita at about this time, and he immediately figures out Wichita has something to offer him. His first prints are shown in the exhibitions, and he immediately starts hustling Seward. There's no other word for it. That's what he's doing, because he understands what's going on in Wichita as far as prints. All these print exhibitions and a chance to sell his work. And again, that's how he's really making his living. So we have a letter from him saying, discussing his two methods of making prints, which ones he prefers, and what he's going to send to Seward. And then he thanks him for his Christmas cards. So they're writing back and forth. We only have fragments of correspondence left. And then I included that wonderful little news article. Wichita seems to be a mecca for well-known artists these days. And they start reporting on Nordfeld. And watch what happens here. And again, they're just countless articles in the newspaper just reporting on Nordfeld, coming to town, Nordfeld doing this. And he came and he taught painting classes. But what he wanted for himself was to learn printmaking. And so he first has an exhibition of his color block prints, and then you can see by 1929 he's writing to Seward and saying, the etchings, 32 in number, went off yesterday. So he's going to have an etching exhibition. So he's hustling Seward, and then you can see when he comes to town for this etching show, and the newspaper columnists, it's big news. There are 3 social events held in his honor. So he's very much becomes a part of the city. And then now we get to the crux of what Nordfeld wanted from Wichita. And in 1929, there's a letter from Seward to Bill Dickerson, who is from Wichita and has worked for Seward, knows Davidson, and he's at the Chicago Institute of Art studying. And Seward writes in March, "Dear Bill," and he says, "Nordfeld was here for a week or so, and I showed him how to make lithographs." And so they're working in Seward's backyard studio, which is down here on the right, and it's kind of becomes the center for printmaking in Wichita, or printmakers to learn how to make prints. A Chili Caps, if you walked past that house behind it and across the street, that's where Chili Caps lives. You walk a block down, that's where the Noble family lives. It's just this tight little community. So then by what's the date on that? 1930, there's a letter from Nordfeld to Seward. And Nordfeld knows Seward is writing a book on lithography. It's the first one by an American author. And Nordfeld knows he's writing a book. And so Nordfeld says, gee, maybe you want to put some of my prints in your book. So he's going to send him some. And what Seward has taught him how to do normally a lithograph is made on a stone. And Seward has really worked on promoting metal plate lithography because it made it more accessible for artists who lived outside of major cities and didn't have access to lithography stones. And that's what Nordfeld has learned how to do. And Nordfeld then takes metal plates to Taos and gives them to Ken Adams and Ward Lockwood, and they start coming to Wichita. So Nordfeld kind of returns the favor by doing that. Okay, let's talk about so the next generation of important artists for Wichita and developing the community are 2 who are really mentored by both Davidson and Seward. They both went to East High, and Gladys Bates, who ran the arts programs in the school, was a close friend of Seward. So she says, you're interested in art, go see this guy on Saturday. And so Seward helps them learn and gives them access to all sorts of things. And again, we have similar but very different backgrounds. Ed Kopetz is first generation born in the United States. His parents immigrated from Austria. And Bill Dickerson's family is from Wichita. But they're 2 young guys who are interested in the arts, and they take 2 different paths. Both of them end up going to the Art Institute of Chicago with the financial help of Davidson and somewhat of Seward. And then Kopetz gets offered a job at the in Minneapolis, and Dickerson decides to come back to Wichita. But they both take charge of important art schools, and we all know how important the Wichita Art Association's art school was. And Kopetz does the very same thing in Minneapolis as he becomes the director of the Minneapolis School of Art and Design. And to get this photograph and all the information on Kopetz, I had a long email exchange with the archivist, the library in Minneapolis. And he said, this guy, all he did was go talk to social groups. He talked to Kiwanis, he talked to the Rotary Club, promoting the arts. And I thought, that's exactly what Seward and Davidson were doing in Wichita. So he'd learned really well of how to promote things and develop the school. But both of them become the key players next for Nordfeld. So Seward's taught Nordfeld how to make his first lithograph. So Nordfeld then starts working with Bill Dickerson, because the important thing about Bill Dickerson is when he was at the Art Institute in Chicago, he took over the lithography program and teaching. And he was offered a job in Chicago, and Seward convinced him to come back to Wichita and take over the Wichita Art Association. But he had a huge reputation by then of being a great lithographer. And what does Nordfeld want to be? A great lithographer. So he spends a lot of time in Wichita. Eventually he trades etching lessons with Bill Dickerson, but he's over in Dickerson's studio making lithographs. And you can see all four of these are actually in the Wichita Art Museum's collection. And you can see his style change. It changes and reflects what's going on with his paintings. At first, it's people and they become more and more abstract and more painterly because Bill Dickerson teaches him techniques of how to do that. So you can see one of the later prints over on the lower right, how it's much more like big brush strokes of painting. And again, this is just a beginning point of all the coverage he got. He was so popular in Wichita. Every time he even considered coming to town, there was a newspaper article about Nordfeld's here, there's going to be a painting exhibition, he's teaching classes, whatever. So he's very much a part of the arts community. And And I love the headline, Wichita Pleases a Famous Artist. There's some just great ones. But, now he's going to paint and do drawings around Wichita. So they carefully follow him. So Nordfeld's in Wichita from 1921 through 37. So he's first exhibited it in the Wichita Library, and then right at the opening and in the Wichita Art Museum when it opens in September of 1935. And he's so important to the town. There's even an article about the fact that the opening had occurred, but even though Nordfeld was in town, he was ill and couldn't attend the opening. That's how significant he had become to this city, that there'd be a special article about that. But this is what the museum looked like when in its earliest days. How many of you came when you were young? I did. I remember that building. Yeah, and so, and that I love this artist's rendering of what the big vision was for this museum. Now what I want to talk about is the other essential ingredient in making all this happen in Wichita, and it's really the patrons. And that's what enabled us to do this show. And I just put the paintings up that are in the small exhibition that we created from the Wichita Art Museums, primarily from the collection. And just noted that it was just through generous people that we contacted that we were actually able to do it. The one on the right was a gift of Ed and his wife, Faye. And Ed never sold a painting. He believed in giving them away. And so the museum has a nice little collection from him. The one on the lower left is a gift of the DeVore family. One above it, another gift from the Davidson. And then the one on the top is a loan from one of my cousins. And it's a Seward painting. But all of them shared in common this great love of New Mexico. Obviously, Nordfeld lived there, but the rest of them visited. The Davidsons spent a lot of summers in Taos, so they have that connection. And actually, Bill Dickerson and his wife Betty, on their honeymoon, went to New Mexico. Another common subject matter that they shared was still lifes, and you saw great ones in the exhibition by Nordfeld, but there's also a wonderful one by Ed Davidson, again, a gift of Ed Davidson, a Seward on the left, and then a Dickerson on the right. And on the far right is a wonderful still life that it was actually in the Capps family. And they worked with us so that the museum could acquire it and have a Nordfeld still life in their collection, in our collection. And again, I just want to talk more and more about the patrons. You can see this whole range of people who were donating and loaning things to the museum. And that's really why this museum has such a spectacular collection. And it is. Everybody who lives in Wichita, you should just pat yourself on the back that there have been such wonderful patrons helping to build this collection, because it's a wonderful collection of American art. And now I have to tell a great story about this painting. When I said we have to do a catalog on Nordfeld, I started reading newspaper articles, and I saw one about this painting being shown. And so I had to find the painting, and then I had to learn about it. So my cousin Dan, who's sitting in the back, it's almost to the point, I think when he sees my name on his phone, he thinks, should I answer it? Oh, maybe not, because I know she wants something. So I called him up and I said, this painting was shown, and I can find this elder family, and they apparently own a restaurant or something. And do you think you could help me? And he says, well, give me a couple days. And pretty soon he calls me back and he says, okay, call Becky Elder. She didn't inherit the painting, her cousin did. And her cousin lives in Houston, and the painting is either in Houston or with her mother in Arizona. So I just cold call this woman and say, you don't know me, but we have something in common. We grew up in Wichita, and can you tell me about the painting? And she was with her mother, who is now 90 years old, and she was in Arizona, and her mother had just given her this painting. And it's of, her mother is the little girl on the lower left, holding her dog, her Cocker Spaniel, which I eventually talked to her, and she said, well, everybody had a Cocker Spaniel there then, and my name was Rusty. But she told me about sitting for what Nordfeld was like to work with, and it was just such a wonderful story. I said, well, did he smoke his pipe? And she said, he never took it out of his mouth. And I said, well, what did he say to you? And she said, he didn't talk. She said, we started out as a group, got together, and he did a sketch and figured out how he was going to organize his composition. And then we sat for him, each of us, one at a time. And she said, you can see my older sister, Mary Elizabeth, is really bored. She's a teenager. It's over the Christmas holiday. Does she want to be spending time there? Nope. She wants to be with her friends, and you can see it in her face. And then there's her brother, Robert, on the right. And Bob Love, everybody in Wichita knows the Love Box Company and all of that. And that's who that is. But it's a wonderful story, and thank you, Dan, for finding this painting for us. And we're lucky Nancy agreed to loan it. When I asked her, I said, would you loan it for the exhibition? The painting lives in Houston. And she figured out a way to get it here. And so we all get to enjoy it. And hopefully someday it'll come to the museum. Now we have one other wonderful, wonderful patron, because we also needed yet one more painting from Nordfeld to really reflect him at the end of his career. And so Eric Engstrom came up with this and purchased this painting and gave it to the museum. So we have a super nice collection. We have a couple of little holes we're trying to fill. But in talking about the patronage, and if it interests you at all, if you're one of my close friends and you die, I don't send you flowers. Instead, I give a print to the museum with your name on it, because I know then you're going to be remembered, because your name's going to show up on the walls of the Wichita Art Museum from now on, whenever that print is important to an exhibition. So it's an easy and a wonderful way to remember people. And if you read labels in the print exhibitions, you'll see there's, one of my friends or one of my relatives, and I give it in memory of them. And we always love it, and you can even give just a small donation in somebody's name, and it will become part of a bigger gift when we're trying to buy a print, like trying to fill in the big hole we have in the Nordfeld collection for a white line print. So anyway, you can continue this long patronage that has happened at this museum that's built this great collection. And again, you can, $25, better than flowers that are going to be dead in 3 days. So I thank you. Does anybody have any questions about all of this? Yeah.
Was there ever a discussion of Nordfeld becoming one of the Prairie Print Makers?
There doesn't appear to be. And if you look, he sent his prints to the exhibitions that Seward started in 1928 that went up through 1990, the annual juried print show. And he sent prints to that for a while, and then he didn't send any more. And it could be we don't have all the records for the Prairie Print Makers. When I started working with Howard Ellington on the catalog in 1980, at that point, the last secretary-treasurer for the Prairie Print Makers was James Swan, and he lived in Chicago. And I talked to him on the phone, and he said, I thought nobody was interested, so I threw them out. I'm just like holding the phone thinking, oh no. So we don't. We'd slowly piece things together because we'll buy a print and we'll see in the artist's resume that they were a member of the Prairie Print Makers. So that's how we've really built the list. We had lists from a few exhibitions from museums that had kept records because the Prairie Print Makers traveled 3 shows. They traveled one that went down through Oklahoma and to Arizona and Texas, and then they traveled one just in Kansas, and then one to the East Coast, and occasionally one to the West Coast. So occasionally I'll find a museum that's kept the records from the 30s or 40s. But, just that brings to mind, so Wichita was really unique at that point. They have the Prairie Print Maker annual exhibition, and so we have 150 artists who we know were active members of that organization. So that exhibition was always in the fall. And in the spring was the American block. It started out as a block print show and eventually expanded to all print mediums. So Wichita, Prairie Print Makers kind of ended in 1965. So up until 1965, Wichita did 2 annual print shows. No other city in the country was doing that. So it's major, and all of you should pat yourself on the back that you came from a city that did this and had such a commitment to the prints. And that's why probably a lot of you inherited prints, because your parents were supporting that, and it was a big event in Wichita. And that's why the museum's collection, almost half of it is prints. And that's an amazing thing to see in a museum in the United States. Anybody else? Yeah.
We know that Nordfeldt taught at the Wichita Art Association. Can you say a little bit about that? And would you repeat the question so we get it on the recording?
Oh, okay. So the question is that about Nordfeld teaching at the Wichita Art Association. He did, and I could probably give you the dates of exactly the years that he taught, but he would come, and the sessions were for 6 weeks. And I think he taught regular classes. All we have are the records from news clippings. And eventually it became advanced students. But he taught, like I said, I think he started teaching in the early 30s and taught through 1937. He only taught in Minneapolis. He taught a session for Ed Kopetz in about 1938 for 6 weeks, and then he didn't return to Minneapolis until 1944, and then he taught another class there. So, so he had a much longer time, spent a lot more time in Wichita. Anybody else have? Well, there's a lot of information, and we're actually, I'll quit talking. And here, thank you.
Such a wealth of information, and you can appreciate and understand. Barbara Thompson is a force of nature. If she finds out that there's a painting, she's going to use her network, and she's going to track it down, and she's going to convince you to loan it to the exhibition. That's sort of the story of Barbara Thompson. Why don't we take like a 4-minute break, stretch our legs, and then we'll be right back for the talk from Dr. Jay Price.